All the unique characters,
I do let him bang. Yeah, I'm a legend, man. I'm building my legacy.
all the stories and perspectives featured weekly.
I wasn't fully committed to that choke, and I kind of sunk into it, started squeezing tighter, and I kind of heard him gurgle a little bit. I was like, oh.
And all the combat sports you could ask for in the best state in the U.S.
Like I said, Ohio versus the world. It's going to happen for sure. Watch out.
It'll be cool, man. I'm not worried about it. I'm going to show them why the Ohio MMA scene is, in my opinion, one of the best MMA scenes in the country.
This is Forged in OH.
I-O.
OH.
Ayo!
OH.
Ayo!
Hello, everyone, and welcome to episode 98 of Forged in Ohio. My name is Jake Murren, and I'm the host of the podcast, and I cannot wait to get into today's episode. I've talked a lot recently about being joined by guests who don't happen to be active fighters in the area, and that's received a lot of support rather than being joined by a coach or a promoter like I have in the past. Today, I'm thankful to be joined by a doctor. This chiropractor and performance coach, among other things, is likely the smartest guest to ever come on the show. Dr. Dylan Seeley is also the owner of Inferno Performance and Rehab. Thanks for coming on the show, Dylan, and welcome to Forged in Ohio.
Appreciate it, man. Excited to be on.
Yeah, I'm excited to get you on the show. Let's actually start with Inferno Performance and Rehab. What's your clinic all about, and what kind of work do you have to offer there?
So the clinic came about as a way to kind of get out of the insurance industry. I got tired of just, treating people for pain, and I wanted to get people to realize that, life's a little bit more than pain. Everybody's an athlete at some point in their life, so we just want to bring that back. So pretty much everybody that I work with gets treated as an athlete. So they'll get the same things that my fighters get, or my hockey players, or baseball, or whatever I'm working with. So that was kind of the whole premise behind Inferno, was to get people to, go back to their childhood of being an athlete again.
We'll talk about MMA later, but you kind of mentioned the different type of athletes that you help treat. How many types of athletes do you treat regardless of sport at Inferno?
A lot. So NHL, obviously, like we're in Columbus, so some of the Blue Jackets guys. I've got some NFL, MLB guys that I've worked with. Some over at the Olympic Academy for either rugby or wrestling. I've got a rugby player flying over from New Zealand next month to get some work in. So just kind of like a mix of everything, really.
Now, this might be a silly question, but do you ever get like starstruck by any of the high profile athletes that might come in that you've helped along the way?
Um, I would say like early on, maybe but I kind of had a weird head start. So by the age of 19, I was getting guys ready for the NFL Combine at the first job that I ever had. So we were training athletes from all levels. And then I got to work with my first Olympian by like the age of 2021. So early on, starstruck, yeah, because you're getting to meet all these pro athletes. And then after that, you're like, I really don't care as much. So now it's not as big of a deal, but it's always like a cool thing when somebody like flies in for, from a couple different time zones away just to get some work in with you. So that's like always a really cool thing for me.
When you're working with such a variety of athletes, how important is it to understand each one to the fullest, the sport they compete in and their strengths as you help and coach them forward?
I think it's huge to really understand the sport, and for that, like I make sure I like will at least get to a practice or watch a game of them. So that's kind of like not a requirement, but it's harped on pretty hard. So even like with my fighters, like I'll make sure I'll get to like a practice with their boxing coach. I'll make sure I'll get to a practice with their wrestling coach. I'll make sure I get to, their grappling or some of their Muay Thai or, just MMA sparring rounds on the weekend. Even with hockey players, same thing. Like I'll watch my guys on TV and then text them later that night about what they sucked at and what we need to work on. So it makes it easier if you fully understand the sport, because it's impossible to play every sport. And especially at a high level, there's a lot of like little intricate details that go into it. So you really got to spend time watching it, breaking down the film, just as if you were an athlete, breaking down film on an opponent. You got to do the same thing from a treatment perspective to work with elite level athletes.
Now, I could be wrong, but it sounds like that almost differentiates you and Inferno from potentially other clinics. Is that accurate with how deeply you get involved with these athletes and their backgrounds?
Yeah. So most places, they have like a little bit of an understanding because they played sports. Like, some athletes were lucky enough to, play at the collegiate level. And that's about as far as they go. You don't really see too many pro athletes transition into the healthcare sector. And for me, I played rugby at a decent level, went up through the ranks, and I got to know the ins and outs of like what goes on at an elite level there. But that doesn't always transfer to other sports. So you really got to put the time in to go learn from other people. So I mean, I've flown at the drop of a hat to go spend some time with a wrestling coach or a football coach or a skill specific coach within soccer or skating, just to learn a little bit more, because I started working with hockey players a few years ago, and I just thought everybody had the same pair of skates. And it goes way more complicated than that, because I grew up in the South. Like, we don't really have ice. We very rarely got snow in Virginia. So to learn a lot about ice skating, like over the last couple of years, has been like mind blowing. The little details that go into it.
I read about the name Inferno on your website. Can you talk a little bit about why you named it Inferno Performance and Rehab?
Yeah, I get a lot of shit for it, because people don't really understand the premise behind it. But one of my favorite literary works, like as you guys can see behind me, I'm a big fan of reading. One of my favorite things is Dante's Divine Comedy, and one of the most popular books within the Divine Comedy is Dante's Inferno. So it's his story, essentially transversing from hell to get to heaven. And it talks about you have to recognize your own issues to be able to combat them, and then move on from them. And it's the same thing with people coming into my clinic. Like, it's, you have to recognize, like, you may not be eating the way that an athlete should, you may not be sleeping the way that you should, and all these little things are going to get in the way of your performance. So you got to recognize them, combat them head on to get to paradise. So like the little saying that we have for the clinic is like, the path to paradise begins in Inferno.
Yeah, I love that. So I tried to learn my best to learn about the road leading up to Inferno Performance and Rehab for you. My understanding is that this path started for you when you connected with Olympic performance coach Justin Kavanaugh. What brought the two of you together, and how did he influence your journey?
Yeah, so Cav's been a big role in my life. I was out of junior college at the time, was initially planning on like going in to continue my baseball career, and realized I didn't care about baseball anymore by the time I got there. So I went back home and was kind of lost. Like, I liked working out, but I didn't really know what I wanted to do with my life. And I found a gym like right around the corner from me. And I just got insanely lucky that I got to work with the coach of that caliber. I mean, we were working with NFL, MLB, Olympic sprinters, you name it. So that was really an eye-opening experience. Then he kind of took me under his wing, took me all over the country and even out of the country, took me to Canada with him a handful of times, just to kind of further my career and my learning. And by the time I finished undergrad, he asked what I wanted to do. I said, I wanted to come back for work for you. And he said, absolutely not. You're not coming back to work here unless you're a doctor in something. So that's the whole reason, like, why I kept going to school, was because of him. So yeah, he played a huge role in my development. And still to this day, I mean, he'll call me about stuff, just trying to help me out and kind of making sure I don't make the same mistakes that he did along his career path.
So it sounds like he kind of pushed you to become the doctor that you are now. But when you first started working with him, did you realize that this was something that you wanted to do, working with professional athletes, as you matured in your own right to what you are doing now?
Yeah, for sure. I would say, getting started in the performance realm, it was really cool because, when you're an intern, like, you don't really get to handle a lot of the pro athletes. Like, you're stuck coaching the kids classes. So it was always a goal to kind of transition to working with those guys. And then, a year or two in, I get to that point and absolutely loved it. and just realized like this is what I want to do the rest of my life. Like work with, athletes to get them to their highest, potential.
You mentioned playing rugby earlier in college, and I believe at the professional level as well. What sparks your interest in that sport in rugby?
Um, uh, oof. I would say like I kind of watched it off and on as a kid. My best friend's dad actually played like high level back in Samoa, like for their national team. So it was like we always kind of knew of it, and we would, essentially like backyard football, without the pads and all that stuff. So by the time I had transferred back home from junior college, I was like, I can't just sit around and do nothing. So I ended up picking up rugby and then went played on the local scene for a bit, and then got a scholarship to play for another school. And then from there, just kind of kept pursuing it. Played for like some select sides, so some all-star teams, and then had a nasty injury, and then that pretty much ended the career. So it kind of transferred over to coaching people a lot more.
Yeah, you mentioned watching rugby growing up, which is interesting to me because I feel like it's not that mainstream, especially here in the States. Every time the Olympics come around, I love watching it, but I feel like that's my only exposure to watching the sport. Do you think that it'll eventually become more popular and more of a mainstream sport?
I think it will. Um, it's just hard with an American market, like because everything is dominated by the bigger sports. The more money you get thrown into it. Um, I don't think it'll ever get to be to the level of like an NFL, MLB, anything like that. But I think you're going to see it grow from a youth perspective. And a lot of those opportunities are actually overseas for athletes. So they'll start like year, and usually by like college age, they're going overseas to play for, some smaller squads over there. And that's kind of how they build up their career. So from a professional standpoint in the US, I don't think it's going to be as massive, but the viewership of it is getting easier and easier every single year. Like, because I remember growing up, you had to, if you wanted to watch it, like you had to get really lucky by being on, ESPN at 2 in the morning on a Wednesday or something like that to watch a rerun. And that was about it. But now you can pretty much watch it on demand from all the different leagues around the world. So it's pretty cool.
So when you're in school trying to go for your doctorate, and then you're also working with athletes and you're competing in rugby as well, how did you make sure that you weren't spread too thin, especially when you were in school and branching out to other things?
Um, for me, it's just constantly about pushing forward, never trying to slow down. Because when you start to slow down, like that's when you're starting to waste time on things you normally wouldn't, sitting around watching TV, doing other stuff. So the more I kept myself busy, like the more I could push myself to do greater things. So I mean, it's very similar to MMA. Like these guys are going to boxing practice, wrestling practice, MMA practice. They get some Muay Thai work in, and if you're constantly engaged, constantly moving, like you're only going to get better.
Is that something that you still deal with today, working with as many athletes as you do, or do you do a good job of making sure that you stay dialed in at all times and that you're not worried about spreading yourself too thin per se with so many things going on at the clinic and whatnot?
I'd say early on, yeah, I did probably spread myself a little too thin by taking like speaking engagements across the country, and then like trying to communicate with my athletes and then going to them and then trying to also run a clinic and build that clinic up. It was a bit of a nightmare at first, but I feel like now I've kind of got the groove of things. So it's been a little bit easier by just segmenting stuff throughout the day. If I have like a hard schedule where I write everything out, it's not nearly as much of a problem, but I'm more of like an ADHD, just kind of wing it guy. And that works to an extent. But you burn out real quick doing that.
Talking with Dr. Dylan Seeley on Forged in Ohio. In terms of MMA specifically, I know you've worked with MMA legend Joel Jamieson and former world champion powerlifter Matt Wenning. How did you actually get your start in getting involved in combat sports?
So I got it initially through Travis Davis, like funny enough, Bam Bam. So he was an athlete at the clinic that I worked at when I first came out of school, and my boss would treat him and Travis had a fight on the local scene, so we went to go watch it, and it wasn't his best performance, I'll tell you that too. So when he came back into the clinic the following week, I said, "Hey man, like, let me train you so that that never happens again." And he trusted me with it, and then I worked from him from that point on, pretty much to like the end of like his fighting career. And then along the way, like he just kept bringing me people. So that's how it ended up with like Devin Gelati, um, Max Metzger, Mark Antonelli, Kobe Woodall, Adley Edwards, like a lot of those guys. They just kept, one guy get brought in, and then they bring in somebody else, and then it just kept building and building from there. So that was pretty cool. But yeah, from wanting to learn more about the conditioning aspect, because the strength aspect was a little bit easier. I had a good background in getting guys stronger, but getting, very conditioned is like a whole different ball game within MMA. So that's where I went through Joel Jamison's course and like learning all of this stuff from him. And just trying to learn as much as I could. And then from there, that led to branching off to learning from other people, and then just kept, snowballing from there until I finally kind of nailed down my conditioning techniques.
So I'm sure it's a lot, but what are some of the things that you work on with MMA athletes today?
Biggest thing is conditioning. Like I harp on conditioning more than I honestly harp on some of the strength work stuff with them. Um, so getting their conditioning like as top tier as we possibly can, so that lets them access their strength a little bit longer. So that makes a big difference with my guys that I work with, and they'll tell you like they very rarely get tired. They can always kind of push the pace. um, from there, we kind of do some back end work with their brain stuff. So I like to do a lot of vision work, because if you can see something faster than another person, like the game slows down for you. So if you can kind of pick up a punch way sooner, you're going to be able to duck under that and throw the combo that you want. Right. So it makes it easier for you to stay untouched, but also stay healthier throughout the fight. So you can see things unfold before somebody else necessarily would. And then from there, it's just kind of layering on some of the joint health stuff from like a chiropractic standpoint, like making sure they're healthy in that regard with their training, and then just building the speed and power on top of that.
Yeah, I love how you described working on the vision with these athletes. What are some things, and I understand if you don't want to, talk about the secrets of your clinic or things like that, but what are some of the things that you can do to help these athletes with something so important, but something that might go unnoticed for other athletes?
Yeah, I mean, I'm pretty much an open book with a lot of the stuff that I teach, just because a lot of people were an open book with me when I was first, getting started. So, vision wise, we'll go through an assessment where we'll test essentially like ears, eyes, and neck, because that makes up your balance system. So, we'll screen for their eyes to make sure, both eyes. Most people think of like, 20/20 vision, like that's just one part of it. It goes way deeper than that. So, do you have, 20/20 vision? From there, like, do your eyes actually work together, or does one shut off? Because a lot of people don't realize, like, your brain will actually shut off one of your eyes, like the signals that it gets, once you hit a certain level of fatigue. So that's why I harp on conditioning so heavily, so that we don't reach that point nearly as soon as another fighter would. Um, from there, it's making sure that both eyes work together, because there's a thing called convergence, where if you track something in, your eyes should almost be able to go cross-eyed and hold that image. And a lot of fighters will struggle with that, because brain trauma is one of the biggest things that prevents people from convergence. So that's something that every fighter is going to struggle with throughout some point in their career, from just getting hit in their head. So that's something that, I like to train up a lot with my athletes. And then from there, it's search and scan patterns, and then a whole bunch of crazy stuff off of that.
I feel like some fighters in this sport believe they can do everything themselves. They have an ego and they're maybe reluctant to seek out help, especially for things like recovery. Why is it important for an MMA fighter to be in contact with someone like you, with the expertise that you have?
Um, Personally, I can relate to that too, because I have a big ego at times, and I hate, admitting that other people are a little bit better than me at stuff. So, um, once I start to put that ego aside, I started connecting with other people, and that just propelled the trajectory of my, career forward 10 plus years. Because I started talking to some of these people, and once I started gathering all this information and I went back to talk to them, they looked at me and they're like, "You're already, kind of ahead of where I was at, 10 years ago, and now they're 30 years older than me." So if you can get with somebody who knows what they're doing, like you're taking out a lot of the guesswork because they've already done the trial and error for you. They know what works best and they know what's not going to work. So that way you don't have to waste that on yourself and be a test dummy. Because a lot of athletes will go through that. They'll see something they like on Instagram, but that's not the full story of like what's actually going on within that training. So they'll pick out something from here, something from there, and then they'll try and make their own routine, but it doesn't work like that. So if you get with somebody who actually knows how to piece that routine together and then connect you with other people who are good at what they do, everything just speeds up with the trajectory of your career. So instead of, waiting, to get 12 fights in to feel really comfortable with where you're at and everything's dialed in, that could be as quick as 3 to 4 if you actually get with somebody who knows what they're doing.
How often do you have to break those habits of fighters that don't do them any favors, or they see something on Instagram or Facebook that they think is going to help them, but really it's just leading them down the wrong path, and then you have to course correct them down the right path to where they should be in their career?
I would say I get lucky with a lot of the guys that I work with because they have a lot of trust in me. And then it's the guys that like reach out to me for a consult or stuff like that, where they have this preconceived notion of some of the training backgrounds. And I always tell them, like, I'm not married to a certain style. Like, honestly, like, you should train based off of your fighting style. And that's going to differ between like whether you're a grappler or a striker. So having that level of understanding helps a bunch, because the style that they might be using isn't necessarily going to translate very well to their fighting style. Like, some guys have a very heavy like powerlifting background, like they train for a lot of max strength, but they don't train relaxation very well, and then they look stiff as a board when they strike. And it's because that style doesn't necessarily match up with what they want.
So results are really important in any sport, and you play a role in the process of fighters achieving those results. How often do you have fighters come back to you expressing gratitude, because they were able to achieve those results in part thanks to your help?
It's always nice to hear it, especially like post-fight interviews after a win when their hands up. So that's always a great feeling. But it's really just like the small stuff. Like, we'll be talking about, my guys, text me pretty much every single day. So they'll reach out to me saying like I was doing something and like my knee, I didn't notice like my knee when I was bending over to grab something, or like I was, riding my bike and I saw a car coming like way ahead of time, that I would have normally seen, or stuff like that. Or, I'm not feeling run down throughout camp nearly as much because we're working on some strategies between like when to time up like nutrition, and then when to time up, like we've got a great IV guy, Sean Carew, so let's send a lot of people to him, making sure that they time that up as well with him. So it's really beneficial, like I said, to have that team, like you were talking about, to have the team that you trust between like their nutritionist, the IV hydration people, some of these other things, making sure it's all timed up throughout their camp so that they're not getting sick and getting injured, because that's when someone's at their highest risk. No one really gets hurt too often or sick too often outside of camp. It's usually when you're in the process of that weight cut.
How often are you working with the people behind the fighter themselves, the nutritionist, maybe even their coaching staff and things like that, to make sure that that fighter is getting everything that they possibly can, especially in, training camp, getting ready for a fight?
I would say it's more so just learning about what they do. Because ultimately, like, the end of the day, like, their job is to be a fighter. So my job is never to like try and make strength and conditioning a bigger role than what it actually is. So knowing what they're doing at practice, and then me changing what I'm doing based off of how their practices went. Because I don't ever want them showing up sore to striking or to grappling or anything like that, because that's only going to make their training session worse. So making sure they're constantly fresh, and that makes sure that, I go and I shadow some of their sessions that they have, so I have an idea of what's going on, but also talking to my fighters on a daily basis to make sure I know what's going on. And then, if we're feeling run down or something like that, then I can talk to, say their nutritionist, or talk to the IV person or whatever's going on, to make sure that they're happy and healthy the whole time.
We talked about the multiple sports that you've worked with athletes in, and is there anything quite like seeing an athlete push through and break through those barriers that you help with, and having some type of role in that journey?
Yeah, for sure. I would say, honestly, like, one of the coolest things for me is when my high school athletes get a college scholarship. because I remember when I like got my college scholarship and how happy I was, and to see like my mom crying and everything, just everybody be so happy about it. Like it's really a life-changing moment. So to be able to see that for some of the kids that I work with, like that's huge. And then like right after that is probably watching my guys' hands get raised in the cage. That's a really cool feeling too, to see them lay it all out on the line and then come away with a victory. It's a great feeling.
Do you have like a particular story where maybe it was a college athlete or a high school athlete going to college, or maybe a fighter that they were pretty low on their own standards, and then you got them to a point where they could achieve those goals, whether it be winning a fight or getting that scholarship that is so important for a young athlete in their journey?
Um, Let me see. Yeah, like I would say right now I've got an athlete that's been working through some shoulder issues off and on, had a surgery, and it's been kind of like a tough go. It's just been a lot of setbacks here and there on some stuff. And then he's had some college visits, and the recruiting trail dropped off for him a little bit, just because of the injuries. A lot of coaches are kind of hesitant to sign somebody up based off of that. But he ended up managing to get signed by like a JUCO school. So it's a huge win for him. Like I know it made the world of difference when he came in, when I saw him like after he had committed. So that was a really good feeling for not only me but for him, to take all that stress off his shoulders, because all he wants to do is play ball, and he's just looking for the opportunity, and now he has it.
I believe I've read in some of your posts on social media that you're brutally honest when you're working with these athletes, and I'm sure that rubs some people the wrong way. But how important is that, to ensure that you get the best, that you do the best job possible for your athlete?
I think it's super important. Um, with coaching athletes tend to get a little bit of an ego about them, and they think once they get on a winning streak, or they start racking some stuff up within their own personal development, they get a little bit too far ahead of where they're at. And I do a great job of talking shit to guys and kind of hurting their ego a little bit, or I'll bring somebody in like a Travis Davis, who's a big shit talker. So that's always been a great thing. And I actually learned that from Justin Kavanaugh. Like we would actually have somebody come in, like a former pro athlete, come into a training session with our younger pro athletes, and just absolutely annihilate them in a workout and talk shit to them the entire time, to kind of knock down their ego. So that way they would actually be humble again and listen to what we were saying. And I can 100% say I've used Travis to do that with some of the younger MMA guys that I've worked with. So it's been pretty great. But being brutally honest with the expectation, because if not, like, you're setting people up for failure, and especially in this sport, you're setting them up to get hurt. Um, so being brutally honest about their blind spots, like the guys that I work with, they'll tell you like they might get a compliment, but then they're going to get a whole list of things that needs to be worked on for the following fight. And it's not me just saying they suck. It's me actually giving a shit about them and wanting them to perform at a higher level, so that they can, make a career out of this, but also stay healthy in the process.
Yeah, I'm sure this happens a lot, but how often do you see someone who thinks they're the best in the world come in, and then it takes one session and then they get quite humbled a lot?
That happens a lot. Um, and it's really just because they've usually just trained a certain way, and they're just used to doing that certain style. And I employ like a whole mix of different styles within the training that we use. So they might be really good at one thing, and then they get completely broken off on the next thing. Mark Antonelli can tell you this like firsthand. We had a conditioning session, so it was him, Max, and Devin, and this is like Mark's first day. And we had a bit of a conditioning session, and I thought he was going to die towards the end of it. And it wasn't like anything crazy. He had just hadn't had this particular style of training. And I sent him, he was flying, I believe, to Hong Kong like the next week, and he was going to be there for a couple months. So I gave him like a conditioning plan of, I only need you to do this, for the next 2 months. And we're going to come back, and you're going to hit that conditioning session again. And what's really interesting is a lot of people would think I would just give him that same conditioning session that we did. I gave him something entirely different that most people think wouldn't translate at all. And then by the time he got back, like, he was completely fine. Didn't get tired whatsoever during that session.
Yeah, that's incredible. When you look at MMA in general, are there things that concern you from a strength, conditioning, perhaps even recovery or trauma perspective that you think need to be addressed?
Yeah, all the above, really. Um, so I would say from a conditioning standpoint, the biggest issue I see is that athletes are only doing hard conditioning sessions. Like they think the harder that I push myself in conditioning, like the better I'm going to be. And we have essentially three energy systems that we use. Like we have one that is like your ATP system, which most people think of it as like 0 to 10 seconds long, and then you got another one that runs from like 10 seconds to 2 minutes, and then another one that runs from 2 minutes onwards. But realistically, it's not like a hard stop between them. They actually kind of run all at the same time, so it's like dimmer switches on a light. Um, and when you're only going really hard, like you're only working one of those. So you're leaving the other two on the table that like you should be training. So we actually don't do a whole lot of hard conditioning until probably the last like 4 to 6 weeks before a fight. Like it's an absolute breeze on the conditioning side of things that the guys have. And people are always like wondering, how are they so fresh coming into camp? Like, why aren't they so tired? Like, why aren't you pushing them harder? But if it's not broken, why fix it? So if we can use that style of conditioning to get them prepped without beating their body up, like it's going to work great. Because one of the biggest issues is like when you train continually hard, the training will only work for about 4 to 6 weeks, and then it'll last you another 2 weeks without you having to train it. And after that, you actually get worse. So that's why you'll see some guys come in and they've been doing this hard conditioning even outside of camp, and by the time they get to their fight, they're flat and they look slow, they look heavy footed, and it's because they didn't peak it at the right time.
Yeah, that's incredible. And I feel like I'm learning so much. I'm sure people watching or listening are learning a lot too. When it comes to the recovery and like trauma perspective of things, what are things in that realm, especially in mixed martial arts, a sport that people can get severely hurt in? How important are those types of things in the sport?
It's super important, especially like leading up to a fight and post fight. Like from a brain health perspective, when you get brain trauma, so even like minor concussions or anything like that, which I mean, you're going to sustain some, minor concussions, and minor being relative because concussion's never great, but you're going to sustain some type of trauma, head trauma. And what happens is your brain loves to run off of sugar. But what happens is when you get head trauma, the things that are used for like actually consuming that sugar get dysregulated like crazy. So you actually struggle with like brain metabolism, and that's why guys get like headaches, nausea, like confusion, all of that stuff. So we'll actually drop their carbohydrate intake massively, like post fight. And so they kind of rely a little bit more on fat and some other things, and then we'll throw in some low level cardio so that they get used to using, that fat, and that helps their brain health a whole bunch. And then the supplementation side of things as well, like making sure we're dialed in with, or creatine, magnesium, and a handful of other things. We kind of personalize it based off of how the guys are feeling and stuff like that, or their blood labs and whatever that might be.
When it comes to things like concussions and the health of the brain, how aware should really all mixed martial artists be of those issues?
It's definitely something that everybody should be like aware of, because we think of it either as like you have it or you don't. And realistically, it's kind of like a sliding scale. Like perfect example is like a lot of guys will have ringing in the ears on occasion. Like that's not normal. And I had that throughout a lot of my playing career, and I just thought like, well, it's part of the career. And little did I know, once I got out, I was like, oh, this is actually very bad. I need to fix this. I was very lucky to study like under one of the top like concussion experts. And he broke it down very well in saying like concussions can affect 7 domains. So you have autonomic, which is like your nervous system, which regulates your hormones, like your blood flow, stomach, like all this stuff. So that's like what gives you ringing in the ears, cold hands and cold feet, dry eyes, stuff like that's not normal. Affective, which is like your emotions, like you'll see some guys have really bad emotional regulation like after a fight, and that's a lot of time due to head trauma. Cognitive, which is like walking into a room and not knowing why you're there. Like story of my life, I have that all the time. So it's something I constantly have to work on. Oculomotor, which is like how your eyes respond to stuff, because eyes are the easiest way to track if somebody has a concussion or not. That's the simplest thing. And then you've got somatic, which is like your neck and your body, like how stiff everything feels. And then vestibular, which is like your balance system. Like people think of like vertigo, feeling dizzy, stuff like that. So it could be any one of those systems. It could be a collection of some of those systems, or it could be all seven of those things. So you really have to, get with somebody who knows about that stuff so that you can fix up every single one of those things. Because one, you're going to have like a much happier and healthier life, but it's also going to make you a better fighter in the process, because now you're more dialed in with some of these things. Like your vision's going to be a lot sharper, your balance is going to be better. Like cognitively, you're going to be way more on point. So you're going to see things unravel before just, waiting for it to happen and reacting. Like you can actually set up your shots better now.
I feel like some fighters might not worry about this until it becomes an actual problem. So how early do you think that awareness should start?
Um, I think it's really important to get a baseline, like at the start of your career, because from there, then we can really start to track stuff and then see if things are getting better or getting worse. But if you're coming in at the tail end of your career, like that starting point is really hard to know, like what it was like 10 years prior. So the earlier you can get in with somebody and get a baseline on all these things, like it just makes it so much easier. Um, but a lot of guys, and this is with every single sport, like when you're young, you're invincible, like you can play at the top of the game, like nothing's an issue. And then as you get a little bit older, things get a little bit tougher. And then that's usually when guys start reaching out. Um, and to get them to where they want to be, like how they were 5 years ago. But if they would have just done that at the start of their career, like their trajectory would have been so much better. Like I talk to like my hockey guys or, MLB guys about this all the time. Don't wait until something becomes a problem, because if you get on top of this early, your play is going to get better, which means your pay is going to get better, right? Everybody likes to make more money. So if you want a better contract, if you get the stuff dialed in way ahead of time, you're not going to have to wait and then, take a lower contract to really have to negotiate with an agent. Like your play on the field or in the rink or in the arena is really going to show like you deserve this money.
How often is that in the back of your mind when you're working with fighters or really any athlete in any given sport, the life after they are done, after they're done playing the sport they're in, and making sure that their life is still enjoyable after that?
Yeah, that's a really big thing with me, because I think that's something that everybody struggles with once they get outside of their playing career. Um, I know like it weighed on me heavily, like as I got out of my playing career, kind of being like lost and not having necessarily like a purpose. I didn't know what I really wanted to do. Like I knew I had a job to go to with being a chiropractor, but it's different because it's also like a community thing. Like you're not going to be around the gym, you're not going to be around the guys as much anymore. Like that's kind of your family, your boys that you go to. And then once you're out of that, it's like you feel like you're on an island. You're kind of isolated, which is terrible for your mental health. So making sure I establish like relationships with a lot of the guys that I work with, so that they always know like I'm kind of there for them. I mean, I've talked to guys even after they've retired from their career, like checking in on them, sending them memes or whatever it might be, just to let them know that I'm there, because it makes such a big difference. And it's great to be able to see the guys like after their career, or like see them with like their kids or other stuff like that. You can't beat that feeling. So that's my goal, is to not only make them a better athlete, but make sure they have a happy and healthy life when they're done with their sport.
In your opinion, what can fighters do throughout their career to ensure that the sport doesn't retire them and they can retire from the sport when it's time?
Um, Making sure that like they're all the little things are dialed in. So like supplementation needs to be dialed in, like their nutrition needs to be dialed in. The brain health stuff, like making sure you connect with somebody who knows what they're doing in that regard. And then outside of that, also having something that you like outside of the sport. And I think that's like a thing that a lot of people miss in every single sport, because your sport is your life. Um, but it helps with that transition once you're out of sport. But it also gives you a break away from something. Like say you get in a slump or whatever it might be, or you're having some issues within training. If you can escape for a little bit, it gives you, it's almost like you're re-energized and you can start new and you're excited to get back into training. But you have to have something in place for that to be a thing.
I'll make this the last one for you because we're talking about combat sports and I just want to pick your brain on it. I feel like I have to ask about it. What's your opinion of power slap in this new endeavor that Dana White has been pushing for a couple of years now, since we're talking about brain health and trauma and things like that?
Oh my gosh, man, it's the absolute like worst thing for you. Um, I don't know why anybody would really do it. I mean, you're pretty much just standing in place to get pretty much cheap shotted is kind of what it is. So it's absolutely like terrible for your brain health. Terrible for, I mean, because a lot of guys are just getting slapped. The thing is, if you hit somebody in the ear, you can mess with their vestibular system, so it messes up the balance. So that's why, like, even in MMA, if guys get punched in the ear, like, that's a really useful tactic because it screws with your equilibrium to where when you get up, it's like you're swaying back and forth. So you can't really see what's going on because you think something might be here and it's actually over here. So like when you're doing the power slap, that's what you'll see. Like they'll hit like right here and then the fingers will get right towards the ear to push air in real quick to mess with the little crystals that are in your ear that are spinning to give you balance to send them overdrive so that you end up falling over. So it's just like all these guys are going to have issues down the road for sure, without a doubt in my mind.
Do you think that the sport's going to go anywhere, or do you think it's just going to fizzle out and die in a few years?
I mean, I'm hoping it fizzles out. But people like watching just knockouts. That's part of the culture. So that's pretty much where you're going to see it big time, is from there. So I think sadly it'll probably stick around. I don't know how long it'll stick around, but I know it'll probably be around for a little bit, especially with Dana White just pushing it as heavy as he is. Um, but yeah, I feel like after a while the novelty is going to wear off a little bit, and that's where people are going to want to see like go back to boxing or MMA or stuff like that, where it's a little bit more interesting than just people standing around slapping each other.
For sure. Hopefully it doesn't last too long. And I think that's all I got for you. I want to give you the opportunity to shout out or promote anything here before getting you out of here.
Yeah. So if you want to get a hold of me, I guess the easiest place would be probably my own personal Instagram, where I have a lot of fighters reach out to me. So I think it's Dylan_Seeley DC. My website, inferno-pr.com. You can reach out to me there. I want to thank, like, obviously you for, giving me the opportunity to talk on here. I want to thank like a lot of the fighters that have also given me the opportunity to work with them. And then just the coaches and the crew that work with them as well. It's really helpful having, especially, down at Ronin. I mean, you've got Vitor, Boggs, Josh, lots of good guys. Ryan Dickey, boxing coach over at his gym. Same thing with, luckily to bounce around with supplementation and some IV stuff. Sean Cruz, a brilliant mind. So it's great to have him in the corner as well. So it's more than just me. It's the culmination of everybody in this. So super thankful for all the people that I get to work with.
Yeah, there you have it. I'll have Dylan's social media platforms and website, all that kind of things linked down below as well. And thanks again for coming on the show. I know if you've checked out any previous episodes of the show, then I like to round out each one of these by doing the OHIO chant with my guests. So, OH.
IO.
Thanks, Dylan. I know you're a busy man, so I appreciate the time and all the incredible insight with all those contributions to MMA that you've made as well.
Awesome. Thank you so much for having me on.
That was Dr. Dylan Seeley, a man of many things. Dylan's a chiropractor, a performance coach, and does quite a lot of these, not only podcast appearances, but lectures as well, as he spreads his knowledge. I hope you learned as much as I did by listening to or watching this unique episode of Forged in Ohio, and I strongly encourage you to check out Dylan on social media for even more information and content like this. While you're there, feel free to search at Forged in Ohio on both Instagram and Facebook and drop those accounts a follow for me. If you're watching on YouTube, make sure you're subscribed to the channel and like the video. If you're like me and are more of a listener of podcasts, well, you can subscribe and follow the show on all podcast platforms as well. Thank you all for watching or tuning in. As always, I've been your host, Jake Murren, and this was Forged in Ohio.